Exciting as it sounds, though I confess that as a nerd, any class sounds exciting to me. In the class, we tackled thrilling subjects like setting budgets, recruiting volunteers, managing volunteers, the core principles of leadership, that kind of thing. And all throughout the process, there was an emphasis on the one thing that is needed at every level of leadership. The one thing without which even the best intentioned, most well-funded, staffed with the most highly motivated volunteers, nonprofit, or any other organization will fail. Trust. Without trust, you can't accomplish anything in the nonprofit world. Frankly, without trust, you can't accomplish much of anything in the world, period. And so inevitably, this led to conversations in our class about the ways that you can build trust, which in turn led to conversations about the infamous thing known as the trust-building exercise. Y'all know what I mean when I say trust-building exercise, right? It's something you have a group of people that do that is designed to foster an environment of trust and increase teamwork and productivity. The one that comes to mind first is probably the most famous one, the trust fall. That's where one person stands in front of another person, or several others, and falls backwards, trusting that whoever is behind them will catch them before they crash into the ground. In some cases I've seen the person falling is standing on a chair or even a table, and there are a group of people. I thought about demonstrating, but I thought, maybe not the best idea. Now, as silly as these kinds of things can sound, and as much as they are often used in comedy shows and sketches, sometimes trust building is necessary. Sometimes in order to work together, in order to reach a goal, you have to take the time to build trust. And that's precisely what I believe is happening in the verses we heard earlier from Exodus 17. It is a trust-building exercise where God is working to build trust between himself and the Israelites. Now, you might notice that we made quite a jump ahead along the path to Easter from where we've been this Lenten season. Last week it was Abram heading off into the unknown. Now we're all the way to Moses and the Israelites wandering in the appropriately named desert of sin. A lot has happened in the meantime. But if you'll give me a couple sentences, I think I can sum it up. Abram becomes Abraham. Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. Jacob has a lot of sons, one of whom is Joseph. Joseph gets sent to Egypt. Jacob and the rest of his sons get hungry. They all end up in Egypt. They become slaves in Egypt. Then they cry out to God. Then Moses shows up, says, "Let my people go." Pharaoh says, "No, there are plagues." Then there's freedom. Then they get to the Red Sea. The waters part. They cross the Red Sea. Then they're wandering in the desert. They get hungry. Food comes from the sky. And now we're caught up. I left some details out. We're caught up where we find ourselves at the beginning of Exodus 17, where at the beginning things are looking pretty good. We're told that the Israelites are traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. In other words, they're traveling the path to the promised land without complaint, at least for a time. And why would they complain? I just pointed out that God was giving them manna and quail, food falling from the sky. Their lives are pretty good at this point. And their assumption was that since things were going well, since their needs were being met, God was clearly with them. But then, as often happens with the people of God, something goes haywire. And the flip side of that assumption rears its ugly head. The people, we are told, arrive at a place called Rephidim, a place that did not have a source of water for them to drink or for them to give to their livestock. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, after walking through the desert, they begin to complain about the situation pretty much immediately, attacking Moses, assigning blame. We'll come to that part in just a minute or two. What I want to highlight first is the change in the Israelites' assumption when they camped at Rephidim, where there was no source of clear, clean water. They assumed, when they camped at Rephidim and there was no water, that since their needs were no longer being met, since they were thirsty and had no drink, that God had abandoned them. And so, taken together with what seemed to be the case when they were traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded, we begin to get an idea of how the Israelites thought of God's presence. When things are going well, God is with us. When things aren't going well, God has abandoned us. Now, we might be tempted, I know I'm tempted, to chastise the Israelites at this point for their faulty understanding of God, to say, that's not how God works. We might be tempted to shake our heads at their lack of faith, but before we do that, might I suggest that there are a couple things we should consider. First, that's just the way the gods, lowercase g, all of them, were thought to work at that time. During their time in Egypt, the Israelites no doubt would have become familiar with the Egyptian gods. In their journeys through the wilderness, they had encountered the gods of other peoples. In every case, the point of religion, the point of temples, was to make sure that the gods stayed happy. And the way to know the gods were happy was to look at your life. If you were healthy and wealthy and wise, the gods were happy with you, congratulations. If you weren't, well, then you done something to make the gods mad. It really was that simple. And that way of thinking was to remain popular all the way through when Jesus was doing his life and ministry, as evidenced by John chapter 9, verse 2, where Jesus' disciples ask that question, Rabbi, who sinned that this man or his parents, that he was born blind? The assumption being, if something bad has happened to you, it's because God is mad at you. There's also a second thing we should consider before we rush to judgment of the Israelites at Rephidim, and that is, we kind of do the same thing, don't we? When life is good, we talk about how blessed we are, hashtag blessed. We talk about how God is with us. And when life isn't so good, we talk a lot less about blessing. We talk a lot more about feeling God's absence or feeling distant from God. Or sometimes if a church is growing, we talk about how God is blessing that church. And if a church is not growing, we ask questions like, well, why isn't God blessing that church? You see, even if we don't make as clear a distinction as the Israelites did, I think we often operate according to that same assumption. When life's going well, it's a sign that God is with us. And when life's not going so well, it's a sign that God has abandoned us, or at the very least, something is wrong with our relationship with God. When that happens, when the people of God then or now, when we begin to operate on that assumption, it's a sign of wavering trust. And over the first couple weeks of Lent, we've talked about how sin breaks trust. How God invites us to travel the path to Easter by inviting us to trust again. To trust that God will provide, that God has our best interests in mind. The assumption that blessing equals God's presence and a lack of blessing equals God's absence is a sign that the Israelites haven't quite reached the level of trust God seeks. And we can see this clearly, how much their trust is wavering, in the way they respond to the lack of water at the campsite at Rephidim. And the first thing they do is they go after the leader. They go to Moses and say, give us water to drink. I find this demand to be somewhat funny. Think about it. These are people who are experienced wandering around in the desert. They've set up a camp. They weren't exactly new to this, so they probably have spent a fair amount of time wandering around the camp looking for water before coming to the conclusion that there was no water for the people to drink. And then, knowing that there was no source of water nearby, they go to Moses and they demand that he give them water to drink. Notice what they don't say. They don't say, Moses, ask God to provide us water. No, they demand that Moses himself produce water for them. Moses responds quickly and vehemently, why do you quarrel with me? Or put differently, what do you want me to do about it? Why do you put the Lord to your test, he asks. Or, don't you understand that God has taken care of you this far and will continue to do so? Moses understood they were asking the wrong person, expecting things from him that he could not provide. People didn't care. They wanted water. And they demanded that Moses, their leader, give it to them. How often do we do this? How often do we turn to the wrong people in the expectation that they will do for us what we should be trusting God to do for us? We demand from our human leaders more than they can possibly give us. We demand that our denominational leaders give us rules and policies that agree with what we think and what we want, rather than trusting that God will lead them and us to where God wants us. We demand that our political leaders give us safety and security, rather than realizing that true safety and security can never come from walls or wars or excluding others or having the biggest guns and bombs, but only from trusting that God will take care of us. We confront the leaders with our needs, and we say, "You give me what I need." And all the while, God is waiting for us to recognize that he has what we need, that he hasn't abandoned us, that we can trust him. But the Israelites, they don't just go after Moses. They start talking about the good old days back in Egypt. "Oh, do you remember back in Egypt? Oh man, it was great. We had plenty of food, we had plenty of water, life was good back in Egypt." And this isn't the first time they've referenced life back in Egypt either. When they were hungry and in need of manna and quail, they put on their rose-colored glasses and spoke dreamily of Egypt, where they had food to spare, completely forgetting the horrors of slavery. It just goes to show how much humans are willing to ignore and or sacrifice in search of the illusion of safety, security, and prosperity. There is a big unspoken question in this text. What is God going to do? What is God going to do? Is he going to get angry? Will he dismiss the people of God and start over? Are we looking at another forbidden fruit moment? I mean, you heard the story. The good news is that the answer to all of those questions is no. We know that God does not respond, at least in this instance, with anger. He doesn't respond by punishing the people. Rather, God responds with patience and with a sort of trust-building exercise. God tells Moses to walk ahead of the people, take some elders and strike a rock, and water will come from the rock for them to drink. And sure enough, that's what happens. God again provides for their need, again seeks to help them understand that no matter what life may look like, whether they are flush with all they want or facing the direst need, they can trust that God will be there to care for them, to provide for them along the journey to the promised land. Perhaps the single biggest truth in these 7 verses is that for the Israelites, the trek through the wilderness demanded that they affirm their trust in God to provide for them on a daily basis. Over and over again, God makes this plain. Don't forget that this water from a rock incident happens just a short time after the whole manna and quail thing. But when faced with a new need, their trust wavered, and they needed God to reaffirm his presence. So it has always been with the people of God. Whether on the journey to Canaan and during years of exile, during the life and ministry of Jesus, or on the long journey of the path to Easter, we must regularly, sometimes daily, sometimes hourly, sometimes minute by minute, reaffirm our trust in God. Reaffirm that we trust that God will provide for our needs, that God holds the key, the only key to our flourishing. Rebuilding and restoring the trust that sin has broken is not something that can be done once and forgotten. Not something that comes easily. It is a long, arduous trek. There will always be moments when we feel like we are the Israelites camped at Rephidim. When we look around after something we desperately need and can't find it. When we want to turn to our very human leaders and blame them for our predicament, demand that they fulfill our needs. That's just part of life. In those moments, we can turn to Exodus 17 as just one example of many and be reminded that even then, God is with us. Even then, God has not abandoned us. Even then, God is working to provide for our needs. As we continue to move towards Easter, let us seek to affirm again and again, in the midst of whatever life throws at us, that we trust God to guide our path, that we trust God to meet our needs, that we trust God. Let us remember our God's great faithfulness. Amen.